Environmental, social and corporate governance, ESG, are a set of characteristics that turn your company more or less attractive for investors and customers. Like your balance sheet, portfolio or patents, it measures the success of your operations. But what's involved? How do you develop a robust ESG? In this masterclass, I'm talking to Dr. Michel De Jong from Inspired to find the answers. Michel, what better way to start than with a quiz to clear up some myths? So ESG, sustainability are the same thing, right?
False.
Why is that?
Sustainability is a broader concept, so it's a broader societal aspiration. It incorporates all members within society. There's a sense of individual responsibility, whereas ESG is a business concept, and this is focusing on key aspects in business like return on investment, risk mitigation and growth.
Regulations are black and white, and any boardroom can decide whether they've been compliant or negligent. Is that true or false?
This is true. Either you're compliant or you're not compliant. To be compliant, companies are not going to be penalized straight away for being non-compliant. The regulations are enabling companies sometimes to be compliant.
Because the world is flooded with all sorts of laws and regulations, so is it impossible for a company to follow them?
This is false. Everyone can follow them. In the beginning, it is challenging for organizations because it's new, and anything that's new requires time and effort to integrate it into the business itself. But in the long term, as we see with more companies start complying with the regulations, it becomes business as usual.
Compliance is compliance. ESG is always the same for every company, right?
This is true. ESG has central tenets for organizations to be focusing on. You're looking at your people and looking at the skill set within your people. You're looking at software, hardware, processes, how you deliver, and essentially looking at resource management.
You can measure the ROI of ESG compliance.
It's really important that businesses do measure that. ESG is a business critical item, and it's important to be able to demonstrate to your decision makers and to your wider stakeholder group the value that ESG brings to your business. ESG is business critical and ESG is a business asset.
ESG always needs an internal champion.
This is true. Where ESG is placed within organizations varies. In the absence of, say, a chief sustainability officer, we're seeing that responsibility is largely lying with your CEO, your CEOs. It is, because it's a business critical function, it needs to be driven from the top down.
In the next session, we learn about regulations and how to comply with them. In this session, we learn about regulations and how to comply with them. Michel, moving on to compliance, is ESG a choice or a regulatory requirement?
You have to comply. It is a regulatory requirement, but that does not mean that businesses should not go beyond compliance. And you should go beyond compliance because ESG is an opportunity for businesses to seize.
Okay, we'll have a look at the opportunities a little bit later on, but how hard is it for organisations to comply?
Like most things, yes, it's challenging in the beginning. However, in time, it becomes part of business as usual.
Sort of going through the regulations, are they prescriptive or suggestive?
They're very clear on what you need to comply with and how you need to report and disclose this information to your stakeholders. At the moment, there are a handful of international standards. However, there are regional and local standards. For organizations who perhaps have a global footprint, we always recommend that they comply with the most stringent regulations because at the end that leads to a better outcome for the organization. So an example for this would be there are standards within the EU, for companies in the UK that they have to comply with, which are similar to the UK standards and those that are merging within the US markets. However, the EU standards are far more stringent currently than what the UK standards are.
So what exactly is in it for any organisation? Should they do it willingly?
The short answer to that is, of course, and yes, they should be doing it willingly. This goes back to the opportunities. So we could separate them into two buckets. The first being those classic business opportunities around growth, value creation, talent, return on investment. ESG just makes good business sense. All about efficiencies if we want to hang it off one word. Mm-hmm. The second bucket is the access to new markets. So as the global economy starts to decarbonize, there are products and services that need to be developed in order for us as a broader society to reach that goal.
I see. So how would these benefits sort of manifest?
So the best way to do this is take two examples. We have, let's say, a company, the CEO, her name's Jane. She's private. It's a dynamic company. It's doing quite well. Because they're a private company, they are flying under the radar in terms of any of the regulations. And there's lots of interest, and she would like to IPO and take the company public. So in preparation for that, she compiles all the documents, pulls everything together, and then eventually we get to the stage of IPO, and Jane hasn't realized, actually, seen the benefits of looking at her company from the perspective of ESG. And she goes to market and realizes that, she's not able to answer basic questions of what is your operational footprint? What is your footprint within your supply chain? What's going on with your supply chain? How transparent is your supply chain? What are the social criteria or aspects within your supply chain? So things like under the modern slavery statement, as an example. And now all of a sudden she has to start considering all these aspects which she hadn't had to think of before because she flew under the radar of any of the compliance. Flip that and think of it of Jane, of going beyond compliance, and you're not having to comply. Now you're doing the why should I if I'm not captured, why I don't have to comply. And Jane is thinking of it from the ground up, going, right, well, let me understand what is my operational footprint. So I'm looking at my offices in London, wherever it is in the country. How energy efficient is my building? I'm looking at my suppliers. Well, what are my emissions within my supply chain? I would like to make sure that I'm working with the most energy efficient suppliers. What are my suppliers' policies around environmental protection? What are their policies around the materials that are going into the products that we're manufacturing? How are they treating their workers? How are we treating our workers? How are we getting the most out of our workers by focusing on their overall benefits and well-being? So when she's ready to go to the market and raise money, when the investors are asking those questions, because the investors themselves have to report this, Jane's in a position to say, yes, this is what we're doing in terms of our carbon emissions. So now when you're going to go to the market and attract investment, that is a much better and more attractive proposition than, well, I haven't had to comply with anything.
So who should take charge of implementing ESG?
With the emergence of the Chief Sustainability Officer role in some organization, in the absence of that, it is the CFO and the CEO.
Perhaps you could walk us through the process from assessment to the transformation of compliance.
The regulations enable businesses to understand where they are and where they want to be. So first port of call, what am I doing? Where is my business now? Where am I in relation to the current regulations? And how long is that going to take us to get there? And that enables organizations to look at their current workforce and going, do we have the talent? Do we have the labor? Do we have that skill set? Do we understand what we need to do in terms of processes, making our processes more efficient? And also understanding what the demands are from our customers and our shareholders.
Key takeaways from this session are: compliance is a must. Compliance is manageable and becomes a routine exercise quickly. You need to satisfy global expectations and local standards. What we learn in the next session is ESG offers business opportunities. Grab them to find investors, to cut costs, to access markets, to grow. In this session, we learn that ESG offers business opportunities. Grab them to find investors, to cut costs, to access markets, to grow. So what can Inspired ESG bring to the table?
We remove the frustrations around the complexity with compliance, and we help them demystify the regulations and help them identify the value that the regulations actually bring to the business. It's all about making the process internally more efficient. It's looking at resource efficiencies. How can we get the most out of our talent? So going back to, do we have the right talent? How are we manufacturing those products? Are we using our natural resources in the most efficient way? When we're marketing those products, are we marketing our products to in a way that highlights the benefits that those products bring, or the services that we're selling? We help our clients understand their emissions that exist within their business operations. And the other part of it, which is the most challenging, is understand those emissions that sit within the value chain. By supporting clients through the process, ensuring that they comply with the regulations, helps them to identify those hotspots within their value chain. That then increases transparency within the value chain, which then leads to greater investment.
Okay, so let's jump into the deep water. How do we do it?
So things that people would have heard is thinking about targets in the terms of the short, the medium, and the long term. So the short-term targets is very much, where am I now? What's my business case within the next 12 to 24 months? And everyone has to have targets. And then you're looking at the midterm, so that's going up beyond the next 10, going beyond 10 years. And understanding, well, how much does my business have to change in order to achieve those targets? What do we need to change in terms of the materials being used in manufacturing our product line or the services that we're delivering? And at the end, those long-term targets, which usually tie in with the UK's collective target of that 2050 to be net zero, that's we're thinking about legacy, a business's legacy. What are they leaving behind? We always say, at a bare minimum, people should understand what are they operating. What is my footprint? What is how do I start engaging with my suppliers? And that is the challenging part, because of how supply chains are designed and how fragmented they are. A lot of businesses don't have direct control of their supply chain, so it's looking and going, well, how do I start engaging with my suppliers? How do I start collecting that information, collecting that data?
Michelle, you've taken us through the process, and it's clear what I have to implement and have to adhere to for the requirements of ESG. But how do I measure the success of what I'm doing?
The first example would be looking at the increase in investment that you're getting from your investors, because this is important from them. So that's one metric. The second would be the efficiencies within your operations. So you are decreasing costs and increasing profitability of your product line and your services. And these are two key metrics.
Let's imagine I establish our targets this year. How long would it be before these targets change? Are they changed annually, monthly, weekly? What?
So if we follow the advice by the Science Based Targets Initiative, the advice is that targets should be revisited every 3 years. Because at the beginning, when we're setting the targets, we have a limited understanding, given the quality of the data that's needed to set the targets. And as the data improves within itself, we're able to look at the targets, at how practical the targets are, and how achievable they are.
So to summarise this session, Michelle, what would you say the key takeaways are?
First would be that perfect data doesn't exist, so don't wait for the perfect data. The second would be that the longer you wait, the more expensive the process becomes in the long term. And the third would be comfortable with the fact that you're going to be revising your objectives.
Key takeaways from this session are: be ambitious, go far beyond compliance. Strong ESG means strong business, investors, risk mitigation, and cut costs. In the next session, we learn how to have a robust, actionable insight and how to become a fast, knowledgeable decision maker. In the next session, we learn how to have a robust, actionable insight and how to become a fast, knowledgeable decision maker. So an organisation has huge amounts of data sitting in all sorts of different areas. How does that impact a business, though?
Organizations have a host amount of data throughout, and they're sitting within silos. For example, there'll be critical information sitting within the finance department. There's some information that's sitting within the procurement department, and all this information is relevant for the disclosures. We work with the organizations, we collect all the information so that we can extract all the relevant data that's needed to help the organization to meet their regulations.
So what are the biggest dangers in analytics?
Well, the challenge is not necessarily around the data itself, but actually around the interpretation of the regulations within the guidance. So for example, what we have in the guidance is there's a lot of optional additional information to be provided that can lead to a different result from one organization who might report against everything, and then one organization that might choose to ignore the optional bits of data they need to be providing. So for example, a lot of organizations will be quite familiar with their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Those are their operating carbon emissions. So your scope 1, that being your direct emissions, that's what happens, energy that's burnt on site. Your scope 2 emissions, that's think of it, that's your electricity. So that's the combustion of emissions that happen off-site. And then your scope 3, that's everything else. So that is an organization's indirect emissions sitting within their value chain, and quite challenging to collect that data. So when you're putting together a roadmap and you want to reduce your carbon emissions, if you don't have that full picture, you're not able to understand where your hotspots are.
So Michelle, I've spotted a little bit of a red flag there because we want to comply. How do we avoid jumping to the wrong conclusions or even different conclusions?
Methodology is key. So a very good example, what we do at Inspired is the notion of materiality. What we do is we don't jump straight to doing materiality assessments. So for example, there's 20 metrics that a company may be required to report. What we do is we look at all those 20 metrics and we go through what we call an applicability review. We go through all 20 of them and assess which metrics are applicable to an organization. A common one is we have to assess the carbon emissions associated with investments. Not all companies have investments we do not need to be collecting data against. But the other 19 will be collecting all the data, and then we let the data tell us which of those 19 indicators are material to the business.
Imagine we have the right team in place. How do we start?
So when we're starting with a client, we like to say to them, you're looking at an average time for delivery of about 7 to 9 months. So we'll collect all the data, we'll be working with relevant stakeholders. Sometimes in organizations, people move around a lot. So once we've collected all the data and we've analyzed it, then we'll start preparing the reports. And in that stage is when it takes on a bit of a life of its own, where some of the disclosures, and a lot of them will have to go to the auditors, and the auditors will be reviewing them, and then the client will be getting their feedback from the auditors, and we'll be helping the client respond to some of those questions, why certain decisions were made.
Okay, so what does a report look like?
The report itself can take slightly different forms. So there's what has to be in the annual reporting accounts. So that's from your compliance point of view. That's ticking that box, making sure you've done what the regulations have asked you to do. And then there is the bigger piece, which is the broader communication of how you're communicating to all your stakeholders. And that is usually in standalone sustainability reports or standalone TCFD reports. So that's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures.
How concise is the report? Are we talking about a 70-page PDF or?
The report is quite concise. So on average, it can be anything between 30 to 70 pages, depending on the size of the organization.
So an organization has the report, concise as it is. It's quite excited about its findings. How does an organization turn these findings into an action plan and get going?
So reporting, we always say to our clients, is the first start. Everything starts from the report. Although you've collected all this information, you've looked at your processes, the report gives you something at the end for everyone to feel proud of, because there's blood, sweat and tears that have gone into developing and creating this report. But the reporting is the starting point. So What is the action plan? What targets have we set? How are we going to get there? What has the data told us? The data's told us a story. Where we are now, where did we come from, and where do we want to go? So the report itself will also highlight those hotspots, those areas where we can start focusing our attention, focusing those resources, and what are the mechanisms we're going to use, which KPIs we're going to use each year to assess and measure performance.
And you'll be able to pick those from the report?
Yes.
Excellent. And talking of where we want to be in the future, let's look ahead to the next 5 to 10 years. What are the trends you're expecting, the opportunities, the challenges?
I see the challenges are going to be around the slowdown in the economy, what's predicted in the coming years. And the consequence of that is that businesses will be focusing purely on what they have to do from a compliance point and not be going beyond. But the consequences of that is going to be that it's going to cost them more in the long term, because we have that 2030 goal that we're going to need to be reaching. So in the context of the UK, that's a 68% emission reduction since 1990 levels. So for organizations who have had a lot of appetite for reducing their carbon emissions within the next 5 years, they might push their goals a bit further out, and in the long run that will land up costing them more money.
So in one sentence, what would you say to businesses that are thinking, right, I've only got 6 years? What would your advice be to them in one sentence?
Just get it done, be ambitious, and you'll see your return on investment.